Hi, and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and publishing industry professionals as well. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2024 conference brings you this session, Rooted in Story, Cultivating the Natural World in Ink. I'm Mags, but as you can see, it says Maggie. Either way works. Any pronouns work with me, and I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. And I'm joined by our wonderful guests. And they're going to give us insights on what it means to write about nature in a story. Take it away, panelists. We can start with Evan.
Hey there, I'm Evan. I'm the speculative fiction author of the novel The Hush, as well as a number of short stories. Some of which have popped up in Clark's World, On Spec, and Fusion Fragment. And it's my honor to be here with you wonderful people.
And then Gabriella.
Hi, I'm Gabriella Buba. I'm a Filipino-American author based in Texas. I have a Filipino-inspired epic fantasy, Saints of Storm and Sorrow, coming out in June, and a number of short stories in a couple of anthologies and on podcastle.com if you want to check those out.
And E.
Hi there, I'm E.M. Anderson, or E. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the queer neurodivergent author of The Remarkable Retirement of Edna Fisher, as well as the upcoming book, The Keeper of Lonely Spirits, which releases in 2025.
And Adrian.
Hi, everybody. I'm Adrian M. Gibson. I am the author of Mushroom Blues, which is my debut novel, just came out in March. And I'm also the co-host and creator of the SFF Addicts podcast, which I co-host with fellow author and my bestie, MJ Kuhn. And you can catch us every Tuesday with new episodes of that. But thank you so much for having me here. I'm very, very excited to discuss this topic. Obviously, from the title of my novel, Mushroom Blues, this is a very fitting topic for me to be participating in. So thank you so much.
So, what does nature mean to all of you? We can start with E.
Okay, so that is actually a tricky question because it is just kind of so foundational to who I am as a person. I grew up in a rural area, kind of near a small town. When I went to New York City for the first time in 2022, I was like, this is nice, but like, where's all of the nature? And it was all in Central Park. And then when I came home, I was like, there was not enough of it in Central Park, actually. I mean, I think a lot about the plants and animals because I'm deeply into birding, and then I'm working on identifying native wildflowers, but also just the land and the water systems, like just everything in the natural world, really. Like, I have such wonder for it.
Gabriella, how about you? What does nature mean to you?
What does nature mean to me? I feel like I'm also really into the outdoor world, nature. When I moved to, I'm currently based in Houston. I remember the very first thing I said was, it's so green all throughout the year. I'm a tropical girl. I know that it's natural for winter to happen and everything to die, but it feels bad to me. So living somewhere where you also have that kind of year-round growing season was just like so wonderful for my brain. For me, not only is it about like knowing the plants and ecosystems and greenery around you, I think it's important to be aware of like the larger impacts on the climate and pollution and different effects like that. So those have been the forces of nature as personified by various folkloric elements is something that is involved in my writing. Kind of the Filipino thought of Anito, nature spirits, becoming upset with how humans interact with the world is something that's very present in all of my writing, short stories and novels included.
And Evan?
Well, I grew up surrounded by gray and more gray in Athens, Greece. And my love for nature started a little backwards. I got my degree in marine biology, not because I particularly like biology or nature, but because it felt like an interesting thing to do at the time. But that got me down a very, very deep rabbit hole of getting involved with nature. And as time went on, I started getting involved with more outdoors activities. I started getting very heavily into rock climbing, hiking, swimming in open sea, diving, just all sorts of things. And there came a point where you start looking at the destruction of nature, and you start thinking about what nature means to you, and something inside you rebels and says, "Well, I don't want this to go away. I don't want this wonderful world, this wonderful planet to go away." And let's also remember that this planet is the only planet where you can get chocolate. And this is very, very important. But beyond that, I don't think I could ever live in a world without access to nature. And this isn't something that has happened consciously. It just happened to be. And I guess it means that it's not even second nature, it's first nature for me at this point. So nature is something that I think about quite often. I do try to get myself involved with educating people and initiatives that have to do with the environment. And well, suffice to say, there's a big discourse about climate change, destruction of nature, species disappearing off the face of the earth. So this is something that does find its way into my work.
And it's very impactful, and we're grateful for it. How about you, Adrian?
Yeah, for me as well, I grew up in nature. So even though I was born in Ontario, Canada, I grew up on the West Coast from a very young age in British Columbia. And so on Vancouver Island, I was always surrounded by trees and forests and the ocean. And my father worked for the Canadian Ocean Science Division in British Columbia, and so there was always a lot of initiative to go out into nature. My dad would always take us camping. We would go hiking. Forests were just in my backyard, and that's the kind of environment that I grew up in. Obviously, I was playing video games and all this other kind of stuff that 90s kids love to do, but I was also out in the forest role playing and using my imagination in conjunction with nature. And I think that imbued this kind of sensibility within me that nature is something that can be interacted with. And I think there's a big disconnect with a lot of modern people that they don't see nature very often. You know, like you live in a big city like New York, Central Park is your connection with nature, or Coney Island and the beaches are your connection with nature. But there's so much more to it. And there's just a rich diversity of ecosystems and landscapes and all these different kinds of things. And so for me to grow up in British Columbia, to live in different places around the world, and where I am now in Ecuador, you know, the Amazon is in my backyard. Galapagos Islands is a place that I can go to very easily. There are just such rich ecosystems in Ecuador that I can access. And for me, it's just beautiful to be able to understand that nature is both something that is to be revered and nurtured, and at the same time it can be dangerous. It can be, you know, a thing that can breed fear and awe in human beings. And so that relationship, the fact that all of this stuff is interconnected when it comes to our history and the ways in which we have interacted with these systems, how nature is a part of us, how we are a product of the world around us, for me is so fascinating. And then obviously mushrooms and fungi is something that I'm very into, but we can get into that a little bit down the line.
Wow. Y'all have very great, wonderful, diverse perceptions on nature. This is going to be a fun discussion. So our first serious question, it's not that serious, y'all, attendees that are watching. It's just me being me. How can nature be used to say something about your story and as a force to be reckoned with by your characters? We will start with the last person who asked answer the last question, Evan.
So nature is something that characters are always going to have to interact with, or hopefully in any case. So, and how characters react to their nature speaks volumes about the personalities. I'm saying their nature, not as in sort of people that they are, but the sort of nature that they inhabit. The nature can provide obstacles or can simply be there for them to admire or not admire. And depending on how you approach, or rather how your characters approach that, that will say something about their personalities. Writing a character who is indifferent to nature does speak volumes as much as somebody who is in absolute awe of it. But also nature can create mood and juxtaposition with the characters' interactions, right? So one of my favorite writers, Cormac McCarthy, probably spends as much time writing about describing nature as he does with the actual characters, and it's never superfluous. There's always a point to be made when you have those beautiful descriptions of burning trees in the middle of a desert. That does mean something. It's not just for the sake of describing something pretty, although I would have been quite fine with that as well. On The Hush, my novel, I did spend quite some time thinking about the environment that the plot would take place in, and I decided to have the plot take place during a drought in order to make a point about the characters in their turmoil. So it is there. Nature will always be there. You cannot have a plot in a vacuum. So it would be a big missed opportunity not to use nature, or not to explore it, at least when it comes to the way that your characters interact with it, and vice versa, actually.
A thoughtful answer. And yes, McCarthy, definitely. We're gonna go to Gabriella. What is your take?
Absolutely. I think it's leaving it out of your world building always feels like such a gap. I often see a lot of fantasy that doesn't really examine deeply the world in which they've placed their mystical land. And maybe it's just the naturalist and the outdoors person in me, but I immediately start picking holes in a world whose ecosystem and climate and the general nature world, if I can stab a hole in it, I have questions. And so for me, for writing, filling in that full world, a world that lives and breathes, that has interacting ecosystems between the humans and the food trees that they're a part of. Like, unless you're setting your story in space, you really can't take that away. And so for me and for my characters, a lot of the time it's living with the land and what the land gives you, and acknowledging the different ways that you choose to use the land and the land chooses to affect you. These things are permanently entwined.
And that is very, very important. I hope more attendees understand that. E, what is your take on the question?
So yeah, I think going along with what others have said about it's difficult to separate because plot doesn't happen in a vacuum. And also for me, so usually characters kind of come to me first, but they come to me with like a premise in a very basic setting because those things are so deeply intertwined. It's really hard to just have one and not have the others. And then because nature is just such a thing that is so important to me and that I'm so aware of and involved in, like that tends to be the heavier setting piece. So in some ways it is about the ways that characters interact with nature, or even like in my upcoming book, like cultivated plants, like you see this garden and you like learn something about someone who has died. They're like, oh yeah, that's his garden. He would just see like a pretty plant and be like, let's try to grow this. Which is also my approach to gardening like 90% of the time. So I'm sure that doesn't mean anything. And then also some of the plot things, it's a ghost story, and as the vengeful spirit that they're looking for gets more powerful, it starts actually affecting like there's this forest and it starts really affecting the forest and also how the forest feels to the characters. So it can really be used like to give tone and atmosphere throughout the story. I think like the basic example is like, there's a storm when bad things are happening, and it's raining when your characters are sad, and it's a beautiful sunny day when everything's great. But it can go further than that too, and not just thinking about the weather, but also literally just like our plants and animals affected by this. Is the character noticing things about nature in a different way maybe than they thought about it before because of plot things that are happening?
No, that's very, very important. Plot is important when you think about your world building. Please remember that. And Adrian, what is your take on this question?
Yeah, so for me as well, I mean, everyone's made excellent points. It's so nature is such a good contrast for characters. It's a good base point for world building and plot and all these different kinds of things. Um, I I love that something that keeps coming up is like the interconnected aspect of it. For me, it's so important that nature, it doesn't exist in its own little vacuum as a part of the story. It's kind of integrated into everything. And so you can have it affect your characters. In Mushroom Blues, there's a snowstorm, but there's also um, the world in which the characters inhabit, which is a city inhabited by mushroom-headed people. And so the architecture and all these various aspects of the world itself are integrated with mycelium and with fungi. And so there are fungal people. And I thought a lot about how to extend their mycology and their biology, the sort of symbiosis that they have with fungi, and extend that into the broader world. How would it affect their architecture? How would it affect their engineering? How would it affect the food that they eat? How would it affect the ways in which they interact with each other socially and culturally? How would it affect their norms? And so I think nature is the kind of thing that can permeate so much, because the environment in which a human or a species inhabits, or creatures, animals, whatever, the environment is a reflection of those things. And so there's so much that you can tell about the broader milieu of your story and your world and your characters by the environment itself. And so even if nature is not omnipresent in that environment, it is an aspect of it. Weather exists. And I completely agree. It's like if weather is like, there are so many things that can get overlooked in a story, and I'll start to punch holes in it as well. For me, it has to feel natural. Nature has to feel natural, and it has to feel chaotic. And so there are ways in which, I think stories can evoke more power by utilizing the environment in which they're set. And so if you can take those elements and extend them and think, how does this affect ABC all the way down to Z in terms of the different aspects of your story, plot, characters, world building, all this kind of stuff. But then start to think about the minutia, and not necessarily like you have to expand drastically with the minutia, just like you don't need to show every aspect of your world. Even though you might do a ton behind the scenes, you have to show what's important on the page to the reader. So you can do that with nature as well, and how that permeates everything.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I know we kind of already touched upon this question, but I feel like we can dig a little deeper, which is, why do you feel it's important to explore nature in your work? I know we said that at the top about it when we asked what nature meant to you, but let's dig into like the craft side of things. And we will start with Gabriella.
For me, why nature is important, particularly in my work. I write Filipino-inspired fantasy. And for me, really digging deeply into setting when it comes to the natural world, when it comes to the plants and foods and native animals that are rapidly disappearing from their native ranges, really showcasing those natural gems and parts of nature that many people even now won't see because of all of the pollution and industry and building up of cities that has taken place in the Philippines. Showcasing those parts that nature aspect of nature is really important to my work, and differentiating it from so much European fantasy where, yeah, there's a castle and yeah, there's a conifer forest outside. And you know this, we're moving on. I don't need to tell you about the set pieces, but no, in a fantasy that is truly regional, I feel like it's really important to dig into those details and explore what that means to your characters, to your world, to having that natural landscape there, that it is their world.
And mm, 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 mm. E, you're going next. Putting you on the spot.
Okay, well, I'm on the panel, so I can't complain about that. So I'm just going to say this right now, that I'm going to talk about my upcoming book a lot more than the book that's pictured on screen here, just because it's more relevant. In my debut, they travel a lot more, and they're like in cities a lot more. Even though I threw some plant magic in there just because I was like, I need some plants in this book. But the upcoming story is set in a fictional town in Northwest Ohio. And so one of the things I say about it is that it is a love letter to Northwest Ohio. I'm not from here originally, and I also know I'm actually from Michigan, so I'm supposed to really hate Ohio. And Ohio is like the butt of jokes across the whole. It's like the New Jersey of the Midwest. Like everybody just makes fun of Ohio all the time. It is actually quite beautiful here. And we have such wonderful natural resources, and like the nature here is like it's beautiful. I love it here. So partially it's just that, just showing my connectedness to where I am and where one place that is home for me, because home is a complex concept for me. And so I have many places, but this is one of them, and kind of the current one. And so that's part of it, is just like I am very connected to this place, and I'm very connected to the nature here, and it's important to me to share that. But then also, as more of a cop-out answer, it's similar to like asking me why it's important to include found family in my work, since that's something I usually do as well, which is just that it's not important, but I just can't imagine not doing it because it's so central to who I am as a person. Like if you ever read something of mine and I just have no nature in it, like that probably is code for I've been kidnapped and come find me, because it's just impossible to imagine writing a story where it would not be very heavily featured. Like again, my debut, it's like lighter because of the nature of the story, but everything that I've written since, all the short stories, almost all the short stories that I've published, and some that are unpublished that I've written, it's very central to everything.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that a lot. A lot of people who know me know the same thing about me. How about you, Evan?
Well, I think I'm going to approach this in two ways. One of them is probably the more boring aspect of craftsmanship, which is you're probably shooting yourself in the foot if you don't explore nature. You can certainly write a great narrative that does not involve nature in any form or shape, but why handicap yourself? You have a lot of opportunities to use metaphor, to use juxtaposition in order to make a point with your narrative. So there's a tool, you can use it. I think it's a great tool personally. The other aspect is, well, I said the word personal already, but the other aspect is a little bit more personal, which is I do want to be talking about nature because there is not a lot of attention being paid to the fact that we're losing nature. And I personally don't care if anybody calls me a tree hugger. I've probably been called worse than that. But we're not separate from nature. A lot of people are complaining about how the planet is going to be in a very bad condition. The planet's going to be fine. It's us who are going to suffer. You can't exist without resources, and in the end of the day, without this natural beauty, what is life really worth it, right? And I'm saying this as somebody who does a hike all the time. I've had some of my most memorable moments hiking through the whole rainforest in Washington State, or climbing a mountain in Poland, for example. So it's not merely about it's not just about the resources, but it's about providing a certain amount of beauty in our lives, and life without beauty, what's the point, really? So what I would like to at least be able to do is to, I guess, impart a certain amount of love for nature, or a certain amount of consideration for nature, not considering myself as any sort of person who would radically change anybody's minds about how they're treating their environments. But if I can at least insert a couple of ideas in your mind about, maybe you should be walking instead of driving your Ford F-150 down the store. That might be a good idea. And in the end of the day, I just want to, like he said, I cannot imagine myself not writing stories that involve nature in some way, some capacity. So, there's that.
Yeah, and that's very thoughtful, and I highly relate. And Adrian, what is your take on this?
Okay, so I'm going to agree with Evan quite a bit here. I mean, everyone had good points, but specifically what you were saying about nature being a useful tool as a writer. It is a craft tool. It is something that you can utilize in order to provide so much context for your story. You can, like you said, use it as metaphor. I think it's just, yeah, you're doing yourself a disservice as a writer if you don't utilize that tool of using your environment, using nature in such a way that it evokes every aspect of the story, because it encompasses all of them. Our environment encompasses us, and therefore your environment encompasses your character. So you can really take advantage of that. Specifically in Mushroom Blues, in my debut, I created this interconnected shared universe that I'm going to write the sequels to Mushroom Blues in, as well as other series that take place in different time periods. But all of it is kind of centering around this idea of fungi, and using fungi as a broader analogy for nature and consciousness, and the ways in which humans and our minds are connected to the natural world. And so for me, a lot of it has to do with sparking curiosity in people and giving them an opportunity to read an enjoyable story, a fun story that is engaging them, but at the same time is sort of suffusing their minds with these different tidbits that might tantalize them, and kind of urge them to go on their own and research more about mushrooms, to understand what mycelium's function is within the fungal world, but also within the ecosystem of a forest, for instance. And so for me, a lot of it has to do with showing both the horror of the natural world, and the fact that there is a lot of competition, there is death, there is sort of colonization, but colonization in the sense of things that are dominating one another, things that are consuming each other, and at the same time showing the sublime beauty of nature, such that people's imaginations and their curiosity is piqued, and they will go out on their own and hopefully learn more about nature. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, I'm going to beat you over the head with messages about climate change, but it is a sort of subtle infusion of ideas that I hope can permeate from me through the story to however many readers end up reading my book. And so I'm using mushrooms as a sort of catalyst to urge people to learn more about the mysteries of nature. Because if we don't engage with nature in that way, there's a chance that we will never solve these things, that the human race will disappear before we have the chance to fully explore and understand the magic of this world that we inhabit.
Oh, okay, awesome. So, all right, we talked about how important nature is in our works. We talked about why you need to make sure it's something to reckon with. So, how would you incorporate nature, or how would you see nature as a character in your narrative? Because we talked about it as a setting a little bit, but how would you see it as a character? Let's start Evan, you're first up on the block.
Awesome. So there's a lot of narratives where the conflict is essentially man versus nature. I'm not even going to say humans versus nature because this is how it's normally been marketed in the past. And I'm having exactly the same thoughts as you about why should it be man instead of human, whatever. That conflict has been milked for centuries. There is a certain apostasy of humanity away from nature, and that keeps popping up over and over again. And there's also narratives that do call for nature to be cherished and protected, which I personally appreciate, obviously. But from a narrative point of view, what really excites me is narratives where nature is almost this Lovecraftian character that is completely unknowable and will doesn't really care about your characters and will probably eat them alive without even realizing it. I'm a huge fangirl of Jeff Vandermeer and a lot of his works where nature is that sort of unknowable force. And in addition to that, I mean, it doesn't even have to be, nature doesn't even have to be an antagonist. It can merely be an observer, or it can also be a completely uncaring god or goddess that merely observes what your characters are doing, or throwing obstacles at them, or maybe even enable them once in a while. People who love fantasy can tell you a little bit more than I can about how nature actively helps in Lord of the Rings, for example, or in Lord of the Flies, nature being symbolized, the Sabbath's nature, the word nature being used in a slightly different manner in the situation, being symbolized by the severed pig head. As far as I'm concerned, I mentioned before, it is a huge missed opportunity not using nature. It's a huge missed opportunity not using naturalist perspectives as well. There's been some great books, especially over the last 10 years, where the main characters are not actually humans. And I'm not talking about anthropomorphic Winnie the Pooh sort of characters. I'm talking about forces of nature. I'm talking about concepts that exist as themes within nature. And that does sound a little bit vague, but in the end of the day, this is the exciting bit about writing, moving away from a human perspective into something a little different. So this is also something that I'm planning on exploring a little bit more, not in the next book, but the book after that. We're playing a little bit more with non-human perspectives primarily. So I got no idea if I'm going to pull it off, but let's see. That's the beauty of writing.
Yes, it is. You can get to experiment with any way you want.
Oh yeah.
I know I'm picking on you, but you have to answer the question or don't.
Or don't. What would you do if I just sat here for 5 minutes like, all right, here's my answer, and then just silence? No, I actually love this question because so in my upcoming book, The Keeper of Lonely Spirits, the main character can sense ghosts, but he can also communicate with plants. Like he just talks to them and then he just understands what they say back, even though they're not like talking per se, and they don't have any direct dialogue or anything. So they actually do sometimes, again, it's often like, it's like potted plants and stuff frequently. He has many of them. And so they will show like concern and care for the characters, typically the more cultivated plants. There is a very brief, like plants can be narrative foils to him, which I love. Like the story starts in Savannah now, just to kind of show his normal, like how he goes about life normally. And there's a line about how the live oaks, which I love, my parents live in Savannah, about how the live oaks remind him of himself because they're kind of gruff and whatever, except they grow towards each other. And he is not that way because he specifically avoids connection with other people. So I love that. And then the forest, as I mentioned earlier, starts to be affected by plot things and kind of starts to get more anxious and dark and things as the human characters are also being affected by kind of the overall mood of this vengeful spirit. The forest is being affected similarly. So like kind of character in a fairly literal sense, that we get, like, again, we don't have like direct dialogue, there's no tree people, there's, the trees are not talking per se, but he just understands them, and so we get a sense of kind of what they're thinking or feeling about things as the story goes.
No, that's not often used, so I appreciate you, Eve, for doing that in that story. Gabriella, it's your turn.
I guess I can answer this kind of two ways, because I have a very literalist answer, and that's because I write an elemental fantasy. So nature is a character in my work, but I think it's important to bring up the fact that a lot of the mythology and magic in the book is based upon early Filipino, I guess in English it would be shamans, but every different indigenous group has a different name. Abulerios, Babaylan, Catalanan. These were very important spiritual pre-colonial leaders in the Philippines. And so much of what modern science is still learning about the indigenous plants and different medicinal qualities of all these plants, that some of them only grow in the Philippine archipelago, comes from the work of these early religious leaders and the work they were doing, the ways women controlled their reproductive health before the beginning of Catholicism in the Philippines. This was all part of the indigenous knowledge. So focusing on that, highlighting on that, doing a lot of research into the way humans have always used nature to treat ourselves, to heal ourselves, was really important to writing Saints of Storm and Sorrow. And then more literally, Saints of Storm and Sorrow features 3 of the pre-colonial diwata, so the gods that are aspects of nature. I chose Anitun Tabu, the goddess of storms and sky, Amansanaya, she is the sea goddess, and then Amihan, who I reinterpreted a bit. She's initially a kite that builds a nest on top of our volcanoes, and because volcanoes are sort of the heart of the Philippines, we're on the ring of fire in the Pacific. Our lands are fire. I interpreted that as the volcanic heart of our islands. And as this book is set right in the beginning of Spanish colonization, and as people forget about or are persecuted for following the old ways, worshiping the old ways, respecting the land as they did, these gods are forgotten, and they're angry about it. Simply put, that's the book in a nutshell. They're angry about it. And I kind of tied their reactions to being forgotten, the cycles of nature. So in any tropical location, we don't have, the 4 seasons. We have the wet season and the dry season. So the climate, the storm goddess is really tied in. Every year she comes, wet season, dry season. Her interactions with the world are much more regular in comparison to, say, our volcanoes, which, we hope stay sleeping. Mount Mayon was like one of the most devastating eruptions in like the human timescale memory of eruptions. So we hope those gods stay sleeping. The Philippine conception of the sea is much more kind than I've seen in a lot of Western literature. Our seas, we say that the sea used to be a more violent force, but then the sky rained down stones, and those stones became the land, and that is what caused the tides. And it reminds the sea not to overwhelm the islands and destroy us. And I think probably with climate change and the ways the seas are rising, we're seeing changes in that feeling towards the sea. But I think for me, the sea has always been, the sea is merciful. The sea is where your bounty of life comes from. Like my people are Tagalogs, the lowland people, the seafarers. There's a sense that everything that you need to live will come from the sea. And it's a gift, basically. And definitely, you know, as we pollute the sea, as coral reefs die with global warming, that bounty is being strained, and that's something we need to be aware of. But in the earlier setting of the book, there's very much a sense that the sea wants to provide for you.
Which we all appreciate. I'm a sea person myself, even though I'm not from there. And finally, Adrian, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that the world that I created for Mushroom Blues, the fungal verse, is inhabited by mushroom people. And so, you know, it's their biology, you know, like in terms of body shape and everything like that, is very similar to humans. They have the mushroom caps on top of their heads, or different kinds of mushroom formations growing from their heads. But beneath the surface, there's so much more going on in terms of the mycelium that is literally coursing through their bodies, the ways in which different fungal people can communicate with each other. They can not necessarily like telepathic communication or anything like that, but they have, through a mycelial network, the ability to read each other's emotions. So there's almost like an empathic form of communication that they have with one another. They can read each other's emotions, they can read each other's intentions, and at the same time, they can, almost like a social media platform where you can block people or mute people, they can hide their intentions and obscure them from other people as well. And so nature and fungi are literal kind of, they're baked into the characters of this world. They're baked into the fungal people and their society and the ways in which they interact with each other. You know, it's kind of like the ways in which mycelium interacts with trees in terms of mycorrhizal relationships, the ways in which decay and death are a natural part of the sort of mycological cycle, but also the biological natural cycle where decomposition is a force that is necessary within these ecosystems as a way to rejuvenate the system as a whole and bring about new life. And so for me, it was really important to infuse a lot of these elements into the fungal people. And it's been really exciting to explore the analogies that I can bring about through the sort of natural infusions into the fungal people and their society. Mushroom Blues specifically uses nature, uses fungi as a way to explore alienation and xenophobia between humans and the fungal people. There are other books that I have coming that are also set in the fungal verse where fungi is kind of exploring both nature and its relationship with technology. And so there are a lot of ways in which I've been able to utilize fungi and to utilize nature as a sort of foundation for creating deeper analogies and creating deeper themes that readers can then take away from these stories.
Okay, so this next question, I'm literally the whole panel I've been excited to ask because we already kind of hinted at it, but I think we should make it more explicit to the attendees, don't you think? So, how does the incorporation of the natural world climate change in real world settings versus speculative? So, meaning to clarify for the audience, because I wrote this question weirdly, how do we kind of touch upon some of the questions, but how do we incorporate like this changing seasons, for instance, into versus real world versus speculative? Like, I mean, if we're talking about a fantasy world, you might be changing the seasons, maybe like just summer, it's just summer. Or maybe it can be like we were saying, climate change. So those sort of things is what this question is getting at. So how does the incorporation of the natural world change in real world settings versus speculative world settings? And the first person to answer is, diagonally to me, Gabriella.
So I'm going to say that I write fantasy that is very, very closely adjacent to the real world. A lot of the times I'm simply taking the fantastical creatures and beasts of the stories that I grew up with, and really thinking through how do they fit into the ecology of my world if they're real. So things like the Philippine sea dragon, the Bacanawa, the Laho. What does it mean to have a giant sea beast that can stir storms? What does it mean that he can swallow the moon? What do you do? And you know, from our mythologies, you know, we all get together as a community, we go out and we scare them away from the moon because we need the moon, we need the tides. So a lot of these questions are more thinking through the logic of it, I guess. And I think that blend of how it applies to the real world versus the what ifs is what makes fantasy special.
No, that's brilliant. Okay, Evan, you're next.
Well, the thing that I really love about speculative fiction is the ability to project and ask what if, and take what you see happening in the world right now and then drawing maybe some logical, maybe some illogical conclusions. But in any case, they're meant to be making a point. So there's not a huge difference between using natural world as it exists versus the natural world as it would exist in speculative fiction, primarily because I think that this world is diverse enough that if you wanted to use it in order to get a plot point, or to throw in an antagonist in there, you can do that. I mean, you can. It's a wonderful planet. You get tube worms growing out of geothermal vents. You get giant squids. You get freak waves. You get everything. Having said that, if you really, really, really want to tailor something to your story, you can do that with speculative fiction, right? So you can, if you want psychic trees, you know, have at it, or mushrooms that turn people into zombies, have at it. I personally don't feel like I need to change a lot, but I do love the freedom that they provide, that speculative fiction provides. So I'm never going to say no to it, but in the end of the day, the real world versus, or rather say the real world, nature versus nature and speculative fiction, those two things aren't all that divorced in my mind anyway.
And E, what about what you think about this? I can feel the anticipation.
Yeah, so I have an answer for myself, but I was going to just mention, so for example, kind of going back to Evan's answer about like theoretically you can change how things work, you know, if you were writing kind of secondary world fantasy. So I read The Longest Autumn by Amy Avery. And so like in that, there are seasonal gods, and the seasons are ushered in when the god goes from like the realm of the gods to the mortal realm. And the general plot of the book is that the god of autumn gets like stuck in the mortal realm, or maybe stuck in the gods. I might have that backwards, but he gets stuck on like one side. And so then it just continues to be autumn in the human world. And you actually see the fallout of that. Like, okay, even if you love autumn, like, you know, eventually if you're living in a world with 4 seasons, eventually those seasons really need to move on for everything to function the way it's supposed to, which is just kind of a cool thing from that book. In my case, I have the interesting position of that I am writing in more or less a real world setting, but it is also speculative. So on one hand, like all the nature, the general, like it's real plants that we have in Ohio, it's real landscapes in Ohio. The weather is like it is in Ohio, except that May is a little bit nicer because I wish that the hot weather and humidity would hold off longer. There's references to the fact that like this part of Ohio is the Great Black Swamp, or used to be, and parts of it still are, and we're working on kind of conserving and rebuilding parts of it as well. So I have lots of real world stuff like that. I also mentioned, I have to plug this because we can't have a nature panel without me plugging it. The first 2 weeks in May, more or less, it's 10 days in the first 2 weeks in May, are the biggest week in American birding. And people come from all over the country and even internationally to see the warblers, and they come to Northwest Ohio to see it. So like my book has that. There are just 1,000 birders being kind of obnoxious, even though my experience with birders is very positive. So hopefully they either won't read the book or they won't be mad at me about it. And so like there's real things like that. But then on the other hand, you have these things where like, you know, like the forest is kind of starting to get nervous or angry, or the plants talking to the main character, or he's understanding them and things like that, as part of the speculative twist. So I think there's that as well, that in speculative fiction, if you want to explore like, okay, what if plants were somewhat anthropomorphized, or any part of nature, you know, what if we could understand it the way we understand humans, what would it say, and how would it feel about the things? I think that's something, I mean, I think you can do it in real world settings that are not speculative, but it has to be more the character imagining it, or like things like speculation on the part of the character, like a fun thought experiment. Whereas in speculative fiction, you can be like, no, this is just actually how these plants feel about what's going on.
Yeah, that's what I like about speculative fiction too. It just is. So seems like so far all of us, a lot of us are agreeing that it's not much different, not much changes. We take a lot of inspiration. What about you, Adrian? Which way do you lean?
Yeah, I'm very much on the same page as everyone. I think there's not too much of a difference between speculative fiction and real world fiction in the sense of, you know, what your limitations are. The only limitations are what you put on yourself. You can set things in the real world. You know, Evan mentioned Jeff Vandermeer earlier. I'm a huge fan of Jeff Vandermeer. Obviously, I wrote a book about mushrooms. So, you know, take his Southern Reach trilogy, which is set on the American East Coast, but it's not really specified. But there's this sort of alien dome called Area X, and he uses real world settings. You know, I think he said it based on a park in Florida. And so he used this real world setting in order to utilize nature as a way to evoke certain themes and certain explorations by the characters themselves. And so I think it doesn't really matter. There's not too much of a difference there, to be honest. I agree with what everyone said already. It's just that it depends on what your goals are as a writer, how you want to use your setting and how you want to use nature to tell a specific kind of story. You know, you can do the pandemic, you can do post-apocalypse, you can do space opera set in a completely distant planet that doesn't exist. It just exists in your imagination. So I think for me, the big takeaway is to think about what your setting and your utilization of nature can do for the story that you want to tell. There are no limitations, it's just upon you. There's so many cool ways that you can take nature and expand upon things that are known, but introduce things that are scary and mysterious and unknown. And I think that is a really perfect encapsulation of what nature does to us as humans. It leaves us feeling awe, it leaves us feeling fear. And there are so many emotions that are wrapped up in it that I think you can take it from any perspective in any setting, and you can make it interesting if you utilize nature to evoke the right kinds of emotions and plot beats in your story.
Oh, okay, awesome. All right, so we're getting into the final question of our panel. And this is going to be a good one because I think a lot of attendees, and myself included, and I'm sure everyone else on this panel struggles with, is how do you know how much research to do to make your world believable? How do you balance prose versus accuracy versus info dumping? To summarize, when is the point that you're like, look, I don't need to do any more research. We're just going to sit down and write it as far as the natural world goes? To, okay, maybe you need to, what are the check marks you would say? Like, what is like a good way to like move forward with? Or maybe you need to continue doing some more research. We will start with Evan.
Right. So I would probably ask how important is that particular element that you're researching in your story? Is it the foreground? Does it provide additional spice throughout the entire story? I mean, I personally am against info dumping because I know it's a thing in certain sci-fi genres, but for me, it shows me the scaffolding of the story, and it tells me about the writer's intention. And I can accept that as a reader, but as an author / reader, that pulls me entirely out of the story. So I'm never going to be in favor of info dumping. Having said that, for the house, I did a lot of research on how farmers react to drought. But all of this was for the sake of making the prose more authentic, because even if readers are not experts themselves, they can always pick up on poorly researched information and information that is inauthentic. And you know that's always going to be that one reader that will get to you online and he will say, actually, you got this wrong. And I don't want to be in that kind of position. So if the element is important to the story, then I will do a lot of research about it, but this is entirely so that I digest it, internalize it, and then when it comes to writing the prose, it will become natural to write about it. It will be as natural as writing about walking. From there on, from having said that, I don't think that anybody needs to have a working understanding of how an ecosystem works in order to write about it. But if you're that sort of writer who does pride themselves about intimate knowledge of systems and processes of nature, I'm sure that there is a niche for you. There's a niche for pretty much everything. This is just not my approach. I do think that the story comes first. Research is there to support the story in terms of authentic prose. And if it becomes a case of research, and if it becomes a case of the facts getting in the way of a good story, I'm probably going to think twice about burdening the story with all that detail.
No, that's completely fair. E, how about yourself?
Okay, so fun fact that for my upcoming book, for like the first draft, I had a spreadsheet of just like when different trees and flowers in the area were like in flower, and when the different trees like leaves changed, even though the story does not even extend to autumn. So why did I need that? And I think the answer is just I like trees, so I decided that I could do as much research as I wanted about trees. I think I did like a Twitter thread before I deleted Twitter of like just like here's highlights from my tree research in case anyone cares. You know, which was just stuff like sycamores are often the first species to come back to like degraded areas where the soil has been really poor, and black walnuts produce this toxin that prevents other things from growing too close to them, and like just stuff like that. Just because, and none of that is in the story. I didn't need to know that. Nobody needed to know that, but I was like, trees, right? Like they're so great. So I think how much research to do like how much research you have to do and not how much you just do for fun or to put off writing the story. I think it really depends on partially just on, is this a place that you are intimately familiar with, you know, from living there? Or if you're writing like secondary world, is it a place that you are basing on somewhere you are intimately familiar with? Or are you basing it on a different place that you haven't been as much, or that you've never been, or what have you? Although I don't know, I always feel like I do way more research every time I set anything near where I actually am, because I forget everything I know about where I am the minute I try to write it into a book. And then in terms of, I mean, I think you don't need, especially, okay, I won't say you, I'll say me, because I like wrote a book set in Northwest Ohio. So I think I didn't need to do a lot of info dumping, because like the world building, there's a lot of world building, but it has a lot more to do with how ghosts work in this world than just how do Ohio's ecosystems work, because it is more or less a real world setting. So I give you enough to give you a sense of it if you are not from this area, or if you're not from a region or ecosystem that's like this, and you get a sense of the different plants and things. But I don't like sit down and I'm like, okay, here is how Northwest Ohio's ecosystem work. But I just kind of give you things like in dialogue at some point, like it rained a whole bunch, and then like a day or two later, like all the water's gone. It was like flooding and now it's gone, which is a thing that happens here because it's a swamp. So like the ground just kind of soaks everything up pretty fast, even when we've had very heavy rains, which is good because we do frequently, the further in time we get, because of climate change. So like there's just like a line of dialogue about it, like, yep, it does that because it's a swamp. And you see the plants because the main character is searching the woods for the ghost, and he's just interacting with the plants because he can communicate with them. So there's some interactions, and so that's how you learn what plants are there. But I don't feel a need to sit down and be like, here are all the plants that are there. And despite my spreadsheet, I do not feel a need to be like, and here's when they're all in bloom or anything like that. It just kind of naturally comes out as he's interacting with the world, because that is a lot of the world is the nature.
Awesome answer. Gabriella.
So I definitely am guilty, have been guilty, will be guilty of info dumping regarding the natural world. I am an overwriter. I research very heavily before I begin writing a story concept. Once I like have an idea of the world, I deep dive into research. I have research library memberships I will be reading for months before I begin outlining and drafting. But then I actually like to stop researching because otherwise I'll never write the story. So once I have the outline down, I write that first draft. That first draft is written basically without touching anything except what I managed to cram in my head before I started the outline. I think that's a way to save yourself from endlessly researching what stage of growth the indigo plants will be at the particular season that your characters are standing next to the field having a conversation. Because once long ago, I spent probably a week researching indigo farming and harvesting schedules. And you can go down that rabbit hole forever. And it's fun, but also you may never finish the draft. So then there's the secondary step. Once that first draft is done, refining, checking a few points. If they're really crucial world building points that you need to be right, stuff like at what time can you actually cross the Pacific in which direction based on which way the winds are blowing? These are important details, perhaps, to some people. Double check those at that point. So I think that's been my saving grace. Research at the front end, research at the back end. But when the writing is happening, you're writing. And you're making sure to serve the story and serve the characters. But there are still definitely points where I'm sitting with my editor and she's like, I know you care about accuracy and precision. And what if we removed these couple of sentences? So it's something that you will see in my writing.
No, I completely understand. It happens, and it happens to all of us to some degree. And Adrian, take it away. What's your take?
Yeah, so I'm in full agreement. I think, Gabriella, your point about research at the front end and research at the back end, I actually really like that. I ended up going down a rabbit hole of, I mean, it's pretty much just been like a lifelong obsession, my kind of relationship with nature and with fungi. So I lucked out in that sense where I've just accumulated all this information, like an accretion of detritus on like a forest floor for the entirety of my life. But the worst thing was that once I started writing more seriously, I kind of got bogged down in world building, and I spent way too much time. I'm an illustrator as well, so I was spending a lot of time illustrating. I was spending a lot of time fleshing out this world, and while I do appreciate now the world that I created, I spent 2 years just kind of doing that and not actually doing the writing. And so, Gabriella, your point about once you sit down and start your first draft, just push through it and get those words out, and everything that you crammed into your head will come out in some way through the story itself. But you can't bog yourself down during the writing process. And for me, I bogged myself down in the world building process that I didn't even get to the writing process. And once I eventually did, I realized, yeah, the idea that I had was complete crap. Like I ditched that and started something new. And so for me, I think it's really important to, yeah, you research, you know, if this is a very integral part of your world, research and figure out what aspects of that particular research topic are beneficial for you and your internal world building, sort of like the stuff that's behind the scenes that doesn't end up on the page, and the stuff that you can then infuse throughout the story. And so one of my beta readers actually came up with this term microdose world building, which I really like in terms of not info dumping. And I don't really have a problem with info dumping unless it's done in a very clumsy way that interrupts the flow of a story. But with my sort of microdosing approach, the world building and the history and the sort of socio-political dynamics and the natural world and all this information is suffused through dialogue and natural interactions with characters, or you know, a character thinking about a particular thing that happened. It never comes in giant chunks. It's very slowly introduced to the readers throughout the course of the entire story. So I think there are different ways that you can approach it, but like Evan said, it's like you need to make sure that your research is in service of the story, that your research doesn't dominate that particular moment and pull the reader out. Because when it pulls the reader out, that's a potential moment where they will put the book down and they will not pick it back up again. So you have to be really careful about how you balance that, and remember that, yeah, all the research that you do is for this story, these characters, this plot, and try not to confuse it too much, because then, yeah, if it's too noticeable, like Evan said, that's the author reaching out of the page and being like, hey, let me tell you about this cool stuff that I know. And the reader's like, I don't care. That's not important to the story. So really be thoughtful about how you incorporate that stuff into your book.
Okay, okay. Well, that was the last final question of our panel. But before we go, I always love ending a panel with a 2-sentence final thought on the topic. So in this case, natural world building. What would we want our attendees to take away from this panel? Your final thoughts, and it's all bets are off. So we're going to do something a little different and start with Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the big one is be bold. Nature is bold. Nature is unforgiving. Nature is beautiful. If you can see this world around you and imagine what it could do for your story, just take it a step further, make it weirder, make it more representative of you and the things that you want to tell, because ultimately those are going to be the things that the reader will latch onto and think, that just blew me away. That was completely unexpected. I've never read anything like that before. So don't be afraid to take everything that you see around you and just go a step further and really be yourself.
Okay, wonderful. And now we're going to Gabriella. What's your final thought?
Final thoughts are, I hope that this panel has been an encouragement to really write unique and detailed natural settings that matter to you personally. I think doing more of that will let us see really more unique portions of the world that don't often get attention in literature. And that's what I love to see. That's what I love to do in my work.
E, your final thoughts, 2 sentences.
Just to piggyback off of Gabriella's, I hope that this panel gives you new appreciation for just the natural world around you, even if it's something you see all the time, like how we have pigeons here, and then I went to New York City and I couldn't stop taking pictures of all the different pigeons. Just really, your natural world may seem just really boring or basic to you because you are there all the time. But I just hope you look at it with new eyes and find new things to appreciate.
And Evan, what's your final thoughts?
There are a lot of opportunities for new perspectives. There's a lot of opportunities for elements that are not very often used in narratives. So don't limit yourself, spiral out, take your cues from nature, steal ideas from nature. I'm sure nature won't mind. And in the end of the day, that is just going to lead to new, more interesting, exciting narratives. And that is something that excites me as well.
And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all for your final thoughts. It's always nice to see and hear and be present for. So, this is the part of the panel where we let everybody do some self promo. So, is there anything you wish to promote? Any places you want to be found? Any places you don't want to be found? Now's the time. So, we're starting with Gabriella because honestly, I'm kind of biased towards that book cover.
It's really beautiful, and I need to let you know, like, I cried when I saw a Filipina brown and beautiful right in the front of it. It meant so much. And you can find out more about Saint Sestaro on my website. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. Honestly, I'm on too many social medias. You can find me with my name, Gabriella Buba. I'm the same across everything. Check out my book. The next book is coming out in 2025. I don't think we've announced the title there. Saints 2, Storm 2. Keep an eye out for it.
Great. Looking forward to it. Evan.
I'm on social media, unfortunately. But you can find me on EA_Mylonas on Twitter, Instagram. That's pretty much about it. And also you can check out my website at eamylonas.com. I'm trying to stay as far away from the internet as possible, but if you write to me, I will answer. Do check my book, The Hush. There is quite a lot of nature in there, the oppressive type. And keep your eyes peeled. There's gonna be short stories coming out soon. There's gonna be hopefully next book being finished in the next year or so.
Great. Also looking forward to that. So many things that's the TBR, y'all. E, how about you? Where do you want to be found?
Okay, well, I also feel like I'm on too many platforms, but I mostly am active on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Eliz M. Anderson. My website is also elizmanderson.com. You can find out more about my writing there. Please keep an eye out for The Keeper of Lonely Spirits early in 2025. It's an adult cozy fantasy with ghosts set in Northwest Ohio. And my debut, The Remarkable Retirement of Edna Fisher, is an adult contemporary fantasy with an 83-year-old lead, and that's already out. So you can find that online wherever books are sold. And you can also check out my short stories on my website. There are links there.
Again, TBR is already filling down to the floor and down to the ground level of where I live. And Adrian, where do you want to be found? Anything you wish to promote?
Yeah, so you can pick up my debut novel, Mushroom Blues, the first book in the Hoffman Report series. That's available on Amazon. You can get it in hardcover, ebook, paperback. You can check me out every Tuesday for SFF Addicts, my podcast with MJ Kuhn, where we interview writers. We do writing master classes, so it's a really good in-depth way to get to know the authors and also learn a lot with a in-depth hour-long masterclass on a particular topic. You can find me pretty much on every platform. I'm most active on Instagram and X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it these days. You can also check out my website, adrianmgibson.com, where I've got some merch and cool stuff that I designed on my online store. And you can check out the official Mushroom Blues soundtrack by Spore. That's over on Bandcamp if you want to pick it up digitally or in limited edition cassette. And you can also stream it on Spotify. But yeah, just hit me up if you have any questions. Just send me a DM on social media, send me an email, and I will very likely answer. But yeah, thank you.
Sweet. So that is all for our panel discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want more content similar to what we talked about here, check out Research 101, a proper deep dive from the 2021 WriteHive conference. There's a playlist in the YouTube channel itself. So stay creating, everyone, and we're going to say goodbye now. Bye.